Death Beneath the Whispering Pines, a Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Whispering Pines. By the time the church clock struck 5, the cheerful sounds of Bramble Heath's annual summer fete had disappeared beneath a heavy blanket of uneasy silence. The silence was stranger than any scream. Only an hour earlier, the grounds of Ashcombe Manor had been alive with music, laughter, and the pleasant bustle that marked the beginning of every English summer. Children had darted between brightly painted stalls, clutching paper windmills and bags of sugared almonds. Elderly ladies had debated the merits of raspberry preserves with the seriousness of cabinet ministers discussing affairs of state. The village brass band had played cheerful marches beneath fluttering bunting, while the scent of fresh scones, roses, and newly cut grass drifted lazily across the estate. Now no one seemed willing to speak above a whisper. Groups gathered instinctively, not because anyone wished to gossip, at least that was what they told themselves, but because uncertainty demanded company. Faces that had been smiling scarcely an hour before now wore expressions of disbelief. Ashcombe Manor itself seemed altered. The elegant Georgian house overlooked the gardens with an almost solemn dignity. Its tall windows reflected the fading afternoon sun, while beyond the carefully tended lawns the ancient pine woods stood motionless except for the constant murmur of wind through their branches. The villagers had always called them the Whispering Pines. Children invented stories about them. Adults laughed at those stories. Yet very few willingly wandered beneath those trees after dusk. Today, for the first time in living memory, the woods had become the scene of a tragedy. A length of white cord borrowed from the cricket pavilion had been stretched across the woodland entrance. Constable Daniel Pierce stood nearby, politely but firmly preventing curious residents from venturing farther. "I'm terribly sorry," he repeated for perhaps the 20th time. "No one may enter." Mrs. Edith Turner folded her arms. "I've lived here for 37 years. I know, Mrs. Turner. I've walked those woods every Sunday. I've no doubt. So surely that counts for something." "It counts for 37 pleasant years," replied the constable kindly. "But unfortunately, it doesn't count as permission." With a faint sniff of disapproval, Mrs. Turner retreated several steps before immediately joining another group to speculate about what might be happening beyond the trees. Speculation spread faster than fact. It always did. Some insisted Lady Eleanor had suffered a sudden illness while walking. Others whispered that she must have startled a burglar. One particularly imaginative theory suggested escaped convicts from the neighboring county. No one could explain why escaped convicts would attend a village fete. The theory survived regardless. Inspector Edwin Hart arrived from the county headquarters just before 5:30. His motor car rolled quietly along the gravel drive before stopping beside the manor. Hart stepped out slowly, surveying the estate before speaking to anyone. He had spent 26 years investigating crimes throughout the county and had learned one lesson above all others. The scene always began speaking before the witnesses did. The inspector was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s whose calm expression rarely betrayed surprise. He disliked dramatic conclusions, preferred evidence over instinct, and possessed an extraordinary memory for conversations that other people assumed had been forgotten. Constable Pierce greeted him immediately. "I'm afraid it's as reported, sir." Inspector Hart merely nodded. Dr. Arthur Lennox removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I examined Lady Eleanor immediately, and I'm afraid she had already passed away. Estimated time, only minutes before the boy discovered her." Inspector Hart thanked him before walking alone into the woods. The clearing lay perhaps 80 yards from the main path. Towering pine trunks surrounded it on every side, their branches filtering the afternoon light into long columns of gold and shadow. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe rested exactly where she had fallen. Her lavender dress remained remarkably neat. Her hat lay several feet away, turned upside down beside a cluster of fern leaves. One gloved hand still held a folded cream-colored envelope tightly enough that no one had attempted to remove it. Inspector Hart crouched beside her. No overturned branches, no scattered belongings, no obvious signs of panic. Whatever had happened here had happened quickly, very quickly. He slowly examined the surrounding ground. Footprints covered portions of the path, though many belonged to villagers who had rushed into the clearing before realizing the seriousness of the situation. That complicated matters considerably. Near Lady Eleanor's shoulder lay a broken pine cone. Several feet farther away, something else caught his attention. A single white porcelain button. Perfectly ordinary, yet oddly placed. He did not touch it. "Evidence bag," he called quietly. Constable Pierce handed one forward. The inspector carefully collected the button. He turned it thoughtfully between his fingers before sealing the bag. "A curious thing to lose," he murmured. Back on the lawn, Bramble Heath struggled to return to some semblance of order. The fete had ended without anyone formally announcing it. The brass band packed away its instruments in silence. Cake stalls remained half dismantled. A dozen untouched teacups sat forgotten beneath striped umbrellas. Several children watched the adults with puzzled expressions. They understood only that something terrible had happened. Not yet what. Reverend Samuel Collins quietly organized volunteers to escort elderly residents home. His calm presence steadied many people. One step at a time, he reminded them gently. There'll be answers eventually. Whether he believed that himself was another matter entirely. Miss Beatrice Ashcroft remained seated beneath the same umbrella where she had spent much of the afternoon knitting. Her basket rested neatly beside her chair. The pale blue scarf she had been working on lay folded precisely across her lap. Nothing about her appearance suggested unusual concern. Only someone observing carefully might have noticed that she had stopped knitting nearly 40 minutes earlier. Miss Ashcroft had spent 38 years teaching children in Bramble Heath. She had learned that genuine observation required stillness. The loudest people usually noticed the least. Several villagers stopped beside her. "Such dreadful business," sighed Margaret Bell. "It is. What do you suppose happened?" "I don't suppose," replied Miss Ashcroft pleasantly. Margaret smiled awkwardly. "You always say that. Because it's usually true. But surely everyone has theories." "Theories are rather like weeds." Margaret looked puzzled. "They grow remarkably quickly," Miss Ashcroft continued, "and are much easier to cultivate than facts." Margaret laughed despite herself. "You haven't changed at all." "I hope not." Inspector Hart approached a short while later. "I understand you're Miss Ashcroft." "So people insist." "The retired schoolmistress?" "I've retired from teaching." "But not from observing?" A faint smile crossed her face. "I wasn't aware that occupation required retirement." The inspector appreciated the answer. He opened his notebook. "I'd be grateful if you'd tell me exactly what you noticed this afternoon." She considered the question carefully. "Would you like the obvious things first?" "If you please." Lady Eleanor appeared unusually distracted during her speech. "In what way?" She looked toward the pine woods several times. "Did she seem frightened?" "No." "Concerned?" "Not exactly." "What then?" "Expectant." Inspector Hart paused. "That's an unusual choice of word." "I selected it deliberately." She continued quietly. Mr. Gregory Ashcombe consulted his watch repeatedly. The inspector made another note. "Anything else?" "Dr. Lennox spent far more time watching people than enjoying the fete." "You know the doctor well?" "I've known him since he was 12. And he isn't ordinarily restless." Inspector Hart looked up. "You noticed all this while knitting?" Miss Ashcroft glanced down at the unfinished scarf. "My pupils often believed I wasn't watching them either." The inspector couldn't suppress a smile. "I imagine many regretted discovering otherwise." "Frequently." Their conversation lasted nearly half an hour. Unlike many witnesses, Miss Ashcroft separated observation from assumption with remarkable discipline. She described where people stood, who left, who returned, who appeared anxious. She refused to speculate about motives. Inspector Hart found the interview unexpectedly valuable. Facts delivered calmly often proved more useful than dramatic recollections. As evening shadows lengthened, the investigation shifted indoors. Ashcombe Manor's library had been converted into a temporary meeting room. Its walls were lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books collected over generations of the Ashcombe family. The scent of polished oak mingled with the fading aroma of afternoon tea. Present were Inspector Hart, Dr. Lennox, family solicitor Edwin Price, Gregory Ashcombe, and Samuel Briggs, the longtime butler. Each occupied a different corner of the room. Each appeared alone despite standing only a few yards apart. Inspector Hart addressed Mr. Price first. "I understand Lady Eleanor recently consulted you." "Yes." "Regarding her estate?" Price adjusted his spectacles. "Among other matters." "What other matters?" "Routine legal correspondence." The inspector waited. Silence often encouraged honesty. Eventually Price sighed. "There was also a draft of a revised will." Gregory looked sharply toward him. You told me that wasn't finalized. It wasn't. Inspector Hart spoke quietly. What changes were proposed? Price hesitated long enough for everyone to notice. Several charitable trusts, and a scholarship fund. And Mr. Ashcombe? The solicitor lowered his eyes. His inheritance would have been substantially reduced. The room became perfectly still. Gregory finally broke the silence. So that's it. No one has accused you, Hart replied evenly. They don't need to. His voice remained controlled. Perhaps too controlled. I know exactly how this looks. Without another word, he left the library. The heavy oak door closed behind him. Not violently, simply with quiet precision. Inspector Hart watched the door for several seconds before returning to his notebook. Sometimes anger concealed innocence. Sometimes calm concealed guilt. Experience suggested drawing conclusions too early, usually guaranteed drawing the wrong ones. That night Bramble Heath seemed unusually dark. Curtains closed earlier than usual. Conversations at supper tables drifted toward the same uncomfortable question. Who had wanted Lady Eleanor Ashcombe dead? Some blamed money. Others whispered about old family disagreements. A few insisted the murderer must have been a stranger passing through. None of those explanations entirely satisfied. Across the village, Miss Ashcroft sat beside her sitting room window with a pot of tea and a small leather notebook. She wrote only 6 brief observations. Lady Eleanor expected someone. Gregory watched the time. The doctor watched the woods. A folded letter remained unopened. One porcelain button. No sign of struggle. She closed the notebook slowly. One thought refused to leave her. People who feared a meeting seldom walked calmly toward it. Lady Eleanor had walked willingly into those woods, which meant she almost certainly knew the person waiting there. Outside, beyond the rooftops of Bramble Heath, the ancient pines continued their endless whispering beneath the gathering night. Somewhere among them lay the beginning of a story the entire village believed it understood. Miss Ashcroft suspected the truth had only just begun to reveal itself. Chapter 2. Rumors Before Breakfast. By sunrise, Bramble Heath had already decided upon 3 different murderers. The village bakery opened at 7:30, as it had every morning for nearly 40 years. Fresh loaves lined the shelves. The scent of warm bread drifted into the narrow high street. And yet almost no one discussed the weather, the harvest, or the cricket match scheduled for Saturday. Every conversation returned to Lady Eleanor Ashcombe. Mrs. Edith Turner arrived before anyone else, although she insisted later that she had come only for bread. I scarcely slept, she told the baker in a voice carefully loud enough for the next 3 customers to hear. Poor Lady Eleanor. Such a dreadful business. The baker nodded politely. And have they arrested anyone? Not that I've heard. Mrs. Turner leaned closer. I've always believed money brings nothing but misery. A gentleman collecting his newspaper cleared his throat. Funny, he remarked. Most people say that only after someone else's money is involved. The remark earned a few restrained smiles. Across the street, the windows of the post office reflected the quiet movement of villagers gathering in small clusters. Curtains twitched. Doors opened more frequently than usual. Even those with no errands found reasons to walk through the village square. No one wished to miss the latest rumor. Rumors, Miss Beatrice Ashcroft often thought, traveled faster than motorcars and required no fuel. She left her cottage shortly after 8, carrying a wicker basket. Anyone watching would have assumed she intended nothing more ambitious than purchasing tea and fresh vegetables. In reality, she intended to listen. Listening had always been her greatest talent. As a schoolmistress, she had discovered that children frequently confessed the truth while trying to explain something else entirely. Adults, she had learned, behaved remarkably similarly. Inspector Edwin Hart spent the morning examining Ashcombe Manor. The estate remained unusually quiet. Servants moved through long corridors with lowered voices, as though speaking loudly might somehow disturb the dead. Samuel Briggs, the butler, guided the inspector through Lady Eleanor's private rooms. Her ladyship followed the same routine every day, Briggs explained. Routine interests me, Hart replied. It often reveals interruptions. Briggs nodded thoughtfully. She breakfasted at 8, answered correspondence until 10, walked the gardens before luncheon, and rarely altered her schedule. Yesterday she appeared distracted. In what way? Briggs paused before answering. She received a letter during breakfast. From whom? I don't know, sir. What became of it? I assumed she placed it with her other correspondence. The inspector's attention sharpened. Did she usually keep letters? Only important ones. Hart glanced toward the writing desk. The drawers had already been catalogued, yet no such letter had been found. Instead, Lady Eleanor had died clutching a different folded envelope discovered beneath the pines. Were the two connected? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Either way, the missing morning letter now mattered. Meanwhile, Gregory Ashcombe remained inside the manor library. He had scarcely slept. The previous evening replayed endlessly in his thoughts. The applause after Lady Eleanor's speech, Peter Simmons running from the woods in terror, the sight of his aunt lying motionless beneath the ancient pines. A knock interrupted him. It was Dr. Arthur Lennox. You ought to eat something. I'm not hungry. You haven't eaten since yesterday. Gregory managed a tired smile. You sound exactly like my aunt. The doctor returned the smile, though it faded quickly. Inspector Hart will have more questions. I expected as much. Gregory studied the doctor for a moment. You seem troubled. Arthur looked toward the window. I've practiced medicine long enough to recognize grief. That's not what I meant. The doctor's expression tightened. We've all lost someone important. Gregory said nothing more. Yet as Arthur left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that the doctor's concern extended beyond ordinary sorrow. Miss Ashcroft's first stop was the bakery. Her second was entirely accidental. Or so it appeared. She encountered Margaret Bell arranging flowers outside the church. What dreadful weather for people's nerves. Margaret sighed, despite the morning being perfectly pleasant. Miss Ashcroft smiled. I've noticed weather receives blame for many things. Margaret lowered her voice. They say Gregory may lose everything. So I've heard. And they found a new will. So they say? Margaret looked surprised. You don't seem shocked. My dear Margaret, villages produce more stories before breakfast than London manages in a week. Margaret laughed softly. I suppose that's true. Tell me instead what you've actually seen. Margaret hesitated. Only one thing. Yes? Yesterday, before Lady Eleanor made her speech, I noticed someone arguing with her. Miss Ashcroft remained perfectly still. Who? I couldn't hear what they said. Did you recognize the person? Margaret frowned. They were standing beneath the cedar near the conservatory. And it was Edwin Price. The solicitor? Margaret nodded. He looked terribly uncomfortable. Miss Ashcroft thanked her without further comment. Arguments between solicitors and clients were hardly unusual. Yet timing often transformed ordinary conversations into significant ones. Inspector Hart interviewed Edwin Price shortly before midday. I understand you spoke privately with Lady Eleanor before the fete. Price looked surprised. Who mentioned that? Several people observed it. The solicitor sighed. We discussed legal documents. The revised will, among other matters. What other matters? Price removed his spectacles. There were charitable donations. Anything else? He hesitated. Lady Eleanor asked whether an older document could be located. What document? A property agreement signed nearly 25 years ago. Why was it important? I honestly don't know. Did you find it? No. Hart studied him carefully. You're certain? Quite certain. The inspector closed his notebook. People often lied. Edwin Price did not strike him as a practiced liar. Yet honest people sometimes concealed information for reasons entirely unrelated to guilt. That afternoon, Miss Ashcroft walked the lane leading toward the churchyard. She had not forgotten the mysterious figure she had glimpsed the previous evening, placing something beneath a loose stone in the old wall. The church stood empty. Only birds disturbed the silence. She approached the weathered stone carefully. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then she noticed faint scratches near its edge. Someone had moved it recently. She looked around. The churchyard remained deserted. With surprising strength for a woman of 74, she eased the loose stone forward. Behind it rested a small tin box, scarcely larger than a postcard. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she examined the dust. Only one clear set of recent footprints remained. Large shoes. A man's, most likely. Interesting. Very interesting. Miss Ashcroft slipped the tin box into her basket just as footsteps approached along the lane. She calmly replaced the stone before turning. It was Reverend Collins. Good afternoon, Miss Ashcroft. Good afternoon. Out enjoying the sunshine? It seemed a pity to waste it. The vicar smiled. I couldn't agree more. Neither mentioned the church wall. Neither appeared in the slightest hurry. Yet after they parted, Miss Ashcroft noticed the Reverend glance back once toward the very stone she had just replaced. Perhaps it meant nothing. She had long ago learned never to assume. Late that evening, Inspector Hart received a report from the county laboratory. The porcelain button recovered beneath the Whispering Pines was handmade. Not modern. It appeared to have come from an expensive tailored coat, at least 15 years old. Only a handful of local tailors had ever stocked such buttons. Hart folded the report thoughtfully. A tiny clue, almost insignificant. And yet murders had been solved with less. Across the village, Miss Ashcroft sat beside her fireplace, the unopened tin box resting on the table before her. She poured herself another cup of tea. She had no intention of opening the box in haste. Some discoveries demanded patience. Outside, the wind stirred the ancient pines once more. Their soft whisper carried across the sleeping village like a conversation that refused to end. And somewhere in Bramble Heath, someone was beginning to realize that a single hidden object had survived the murder. Someone who would soon be desperate to recover it. Chapter 3. The Letter That Wasn't There. The following morning arrived beneath a blanket of low gray clouds that seemed to press gently upon Bramble Heath. Rain had not yet begun to fall, but the air carried that unmistakable heaviness that often preceded a summer shower. The gardens of Ashcombe Manor glistened with dew, and the towering pines beyond the estate swayed softly in the morning breeze, their endless whispers seeming louder now that laughter no longer echoed from the fake grounds. For the first time in decades, the manor felt abandoned. The servants moved quietly through polished corridors, speaking only when necessary. Breakfast trays were collected untouched. Curtains remained partially drawn despite the daylight. Lady Eleanor had been the center of the household for nearly 40 years. Without her, every room seemed larger, and somehow colder. Inspector Edwin Hart arrived shortly after 9, carrying a leather case filled with notes collected during the previous day. He disliked relying upon first impressions. Murders had a habit of encouraging dramatic theories during their opening hours, only to dismantle them piece by piece once careful investigation began. He preferred patience. Samuel Briggs met him in the entrance hall. "The family solicitor has returned, sir." "So has Mr. Gregory?" "Yes." "And the doctor?" "He arrived only moments ago." Hart nodded. "Good." There were several conversations he intended to revisit. Yesterday, everyone had spoken while still under the influence of shock. Today, grief would begin giving way to caution. People became far more careful once they realized their words might matter. Gregory Ashcombe stood alone in the conservatory overlooking the rose gardens. His jacket hung loosely over one arm as he stared through rain-speckled glass toward the distant woodland. Inspector Hart approached quietly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Gregory turned. "I doubt either of us has enjoyed much peace." "I'm afraid not." For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Hart opened his notebook. "I'd like to ask about your aunt's plans." Gregory nodded. "I expected that. Did Lady Eleanor tell you she intended to alter her will?" "She hinted." "Were you surprised?" "No." Hart looked up. "No? My aunt believed money should accomplish something useful, and reducing your inheritance." Gregory gave a weary smile. "I suspect she thought I'd already inherited enough advantages." "You weren't angry? Would you believe me if I said no?" "I'd rather hear the truth." Gregory walked slowly toward one of the conservatory windows. "When my parents died, my aunt raised me." His voice softened. "She paid for my education." He looked toward the gardens. "She also spent most of my adult life reminding me that privilege without purpose was merely selfishness." "Did you agree?" "Not always." "Did you argue?" "Frequently." He sighed. "But arguments aren't the same as hatred." Inspector Hart made another note. People often quarreled with those they loved most. The existence of disagreement proved remarkably little. Meanwhile, Miss Beatrice Ashcroft remained at her cottage, studying the small tin box she had recovered from the churchyard wall. It rested upon her dining table beside a freshly brewed pot of Earl Grey. She had delayed opening it until daylight. Not from fear, simply from habit. Important discoveries deserved clear thinking. The box showed signs of age. Its corners were worn smooth, and the faded green paint had almost disappeared beneath years of handling. There was no lock, only a simple metal clasp. Miss Ashcroft lifted it gently. Inside lay 3 objects. The first was a yellowed photograph. It showed 4 young people standing beneath the very same whispering pines nearly 25 years earlier. Lady Eleanor smiled warmly at the center. Beside her stood a younger Samuel Briggs. On her other side stood Edwin Price. The fourth person had his face partly hidden by a folded corner of the photograph. Curious. The second object was an old silver key. Small, beautifully made, entirely unmarked. The third item interested Miss Ashcroft most of all. It was a single sheet of folded paper. Blank. She examined both sides carefully. Nothing. Not a word. Most people would have concluded the paper meaningless. Miss Ashcroft did not. No one carefully hid an empty sheet of paper inside a concealed box. Not unless it had once contained something, or was intended to. She carefully returned everything to the box. Questions were multiplying. Answers remained remarkably scarce. Across the village, Margaret Bell welcomed 2 neighbors into her sitting room. Officially, they had gathered to discuss flowers for Lady Eleanor's memorial service. Unofficially, they hoped someone might know more about the murder. I heard the police searched Gregory's room. Who told you? My cousin's daughter. She lives in York. Exactly. No one questioned the logic. Margaret poured tea before speaking. I think we're all becoming rather foolish. What do you mean? We're repeating stories we've never witnessed. Her guests exchanged guilty glances. Margaret continued quietly. Lady Eleanor deserved better than rumors. For a few moments silence settled over the room. Then one visitor spoke. I did notice something. Margaret looked up. What? The morning before the fete. Yes. I saw Dr. Lennox leaving the manor unusually early. Was Lady Eleanor unwell? I don't know. He seemed upset. Margaret stored the information away. Not because it proved anything. Because it might someday explain something. Inspector Hart spent the afternoon examining Lady Eleanor's correspondence. Most letters concerned charities, village improvements, or ordinary household matters. One envelope, however, had clearly been removed from its place. The empty space remained obvious among the neatly arranged files. Hart turned toward Samuel Briggs. Was Lady Eleanor meticulous? Exceptionally so. Then she wouldn't simply misplace a letter. No, sir. Which means someone removed it. Briggs hesitated. Or she carried it with her. The inspector considered that possibility. Lady Eleanor had indeed died holding an envelope. Yet the folded paper inside contained nothing more than an invitation to the village fete written weeks earlier. It seemed absurd. Why would she clutch an old invitation while walking alone into the woods? Unless someone had replaced whatever had originally been inside. The thought lingered. It explained nothing. Yet it disturbed him. That evening, Miss Ashcroft decided to revisit the woodland path. The police cordon remained, but Inspector Hart had already granted her permission to walk the outer trails provided she disturbed nothing. She carried only a walking stick and her quiet patience. The clearing appeared unchanged. Wind stirred the branches overhead. Pine needles carpeted the ground. She stood exactly where Lady Eleanor had fallen, not looking downward, looking outward. Where had Lady Eleanor been facing? Toward the oldest pine. Miss Ashcroft slowly followed the line of sight. About 30 feet away, the trunk bore an unusual scar where lightning had struck years earlier. She approached. Half hidden among moss lay a weathered wooden bench. It overlooked the clearing. Someone sitting there would have seen Lady Eleanor approach long before she arrived. Miss Ashcroft sat for a moment. She listened. The woods were not silent. Birdsong echoed overhead. Branches creaked gently. Somewhere a squirrel darted across fallen leaves. And beneath those ordinary sounds remained the whisper of the pines. Suddenly she noticed something else. A faint impression in the damp earth beside the bench. Not recent, but preserved by the previous night's moisture. A walking stick. Someone had stood there for several minutes. Watching. Waiting. She examined the mark carefully. Its ferrule was unusually narrow. Almost elegant. Not the thick rubber tip commonly fitted to modern walking sticks. Interesting. She smiled almost imperceptibly. Small details often possessed astonishingly long memories. As darkness settled over Bramble Heath, Inspector Hart returned to the station carrying a growing collection of unanswered questions. A missing letter, a hidden box, a revised will, a mysterious photograph, a porcelain button, and now, according to Constable Pierce's latest report, another curious discovery. A gardener clearing flower beds near the manor's east wall had found the torn corner of an expensive coat. One button was missing. The inspector unfolded the evidence carefully. The fabric was dark wool, finely tailored. Old. His thoughts immediately returned to the porcelain button recovered beneath the whispering pines. He did not yet know whose coat it had belonged to, but somewhere in Bramble Heath, someone almost certainly did. And that person had just become far more dangerous than anyone had first imagined. Chapter 4: Shadows from 25 years ago. Rain finally arrived during the night. Not the fierce summer storm the villagers had expected, but a slow, steady rainfall that seemed determined to soak every hedge, rooftop, and cobbled lane in Bramble Heath. By morning, the gardens shimmered beneath a silver mist, and the towering pines beyond Ashcombe Manor stood darker than ever, their trunks glistening with moisture. The village awakened reluctantly. Even those who ordinarily welcomed rainy mornings found little comfort in the weather. Lady Eleanor's death remained the only subject anyone wished to discuss, though each retelling grew slightly different from the last. Miss Beatrice Ashcroft often remarked that memories had an unfortunate habit of improving themselves. Facts rarely did. Inspector Edwin Hart reached the county archives shortly after 9. The building occupied the oldest wing of the magistrate's offices, where shelves stretched from floor to ceiling beneath high windows clouded by decades of dust. Leather-bound ledgers filled the room with the faint scent of old paper and polished wood. An elderly archivist greeted him with quiet enthusiasm. "Back again, Inspector? I'm looking into Ashcombe Manor." The archivist raised an eyebrow. "I suspected you might." He disappeared among the shelves and returned carrying several heavy record books. "The Ashcombe family has been here for generations." Hart opened the oldest ledger. Property transfers, birth records, estate surveys. Nothing immediately unusual. Then one entry caught his eye. 25 years earlier, a charitable trust had been established by Lady Eleanor and 3 additional trustees. The names were familiar: Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, Edwin Price, Samuel Briggs, and Thomas Elwood. Hart paused. Thomas Elwood. The name appeared nowhere in the current investigation. Yet it was also the missing face in the old photograph Miss Ashcroft had found hidden inside the tin box. Interesting. Very interesting. What became of Mr. Elwood? Hart asked. The archivist adjusted his spectacles. He disappeared from the village many years ago. Disappeared? So far as anyone knew. No forwarding address. None recorded. Hart made a careful note. People occasionally left villages without explanation, but villages rarely forgot them. Meanwhile, Miss Ashcroft walked toward the manor carrying a basket of freshly baked scones. She had no particular reason to visit Samuel Briggs. At least none she intended to mention. The butler welcomed her warmly. "You've been kind enough to bring provisions. I've learned investigations improve considerably after proper breakfasts." A faint smile crossed Briggs's face. "I believe Lady Eleanor would have approved." He led her into the morning room overlooking the gardens. For several minutes, they spoke of entirely ordinary things. The rain, the roses, the declining quality of modern umbrellas. Only after tea had been poured did Miss Ashcroft casually ask, "Did you know Thomas Elwood?" The teacup paused halfway to Briggs's lips. Only for an instant, but it was enough. "I haven't heard that name in years." "So you did know him?" "We all did." "What sort of man was he?" Briggs stared toward the rain-covered windows. "He arrived here shortly after Lady Eleanor inherited the estate." "As what?" "The estate manager." "Were they close?" "They respected one another." Miss Ashcroft noticed his choice of words. "Respect. Not friendship. Not affection. Just respect." "And why did he leave?" Briggs hesitated. No one ever knew for certain. Surely someone had an opinion. He smiled sadly. "In villages, Miss Ashcroft, opinions are plentiful. The truth, much rarer." She allowed the silence to settle. People often continued speaking simply because silence became uncomfortable. Briggs eventually did exactly that. There were rumors. What sort of rumors? Financial disagreements. Anything proven? No. Did Lady Eleanor trust him? I believe she once trusted him completely. The answer lingered in the room long after it had been spoken. At the police station, Constable Daniel Pierce arrived carrying another report. The tailor identified the fabric. Inspector Hart looked up. "The coat?" "Yes, sir. It was made by Frederick Lawson of Market Havers." Hart recognized the name immediately. Lawson had been one of the finest tailors in the county. His garments were expensive and produced in very limited numbers. Can he identify the customer? He believes so. When He'll meet us this afternoon. Hart closed the file. The torn cloth and missing porcelain button had just become significantly more important. That afternoon, they drove to Lawson's small tailoring shop. The elderly tailor examined both the button and torn fabric through a magnifying lens. "I remember this cloth." "You do?" "Perfectly. It was uncommon." Hart waited patiently. "I made only 3 coats using this material." "3?" Lawson nodded. "One for the late Colonel Ashcombe." He paused. "One for Edwin Price. And the third?" The tailor frowned thoughtfully. "Thomas Elwood." The room became perfectly still. Hart thanked the tailor before returning to his motor car. Thomas Elwood again, a man who had vanished decades earlier. A coat that had lost its button beneath the whispering pines. Either coincidence had become remarkably ambitious, or someone wanted the investigation looking toward the past. Back in Bramble Heath, Gregory Ashcombe wandered the estate gardens alone. He stopped beside the old cedar tree where his aunt had spoken privately with Edwin Price before the fete. The conversation replayed endlessly in his memory. He had not heard their words, only Lady Eleanor's final sentence. "You cannot hide it forever." At the time, he had assumed they were discussing legal documents. Now he wasn't so certain. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look exhausted." It was Margaret Bell carrying flowers for the memorial service. "I suppose I am. The whole village is talking." "I know. They're saying terrible things." Gregory smiled faintly. "Villages usually do." Margaret hesitated. "May I ask something?" "Of course. Did your aunt seem frightened recently?" Gregory considered carefully. "No. Not even a little?" "No." "What did she seem?" He looked toward the distant pine woods. "Determined." The answer surprised even him. "Determined. Not frightened." Exactly the word Miss Ashcroft herself had privately begun using. Late that evening, Miss Ashcroft finally returned to the mysterious photograph. She placed it beneath a reading lamp and examined every detail with a small magnifying glass she had owned since her teaching days. Lady Eleanor, Samuel Briggs, Edwin Price, and the fourth figure. At first, the folded corner appeared accidental, but something about it seemed wrong. Paper rarely folded itself so neatly. She carefully lifted the crease. The hidden portion revealed only part of the missing man's face. Enough to notice one curious feature: a narrow scar running from his left ear toward his jaw. She sat back thoughtfully. Scars possessed remarkable persistence. Unlike memories, they rarely changed with time. She reached for another object lying inside the tin box, the small silver key. Until now it had seemed impossible to identify. As she turned it over in the light, she noticed tiny engraved initials almost invisible beneath years of wear. T. Thomas Elwood. Her heartbeat quickened, not from excitement, but from certainty. The key had belonged to the missing trustee. But why had Lady Eleanor hidden it? And what did it open? Just before midnight, Inspector Hart received an unexpected visitor. Constable Pierce entered carrying a sealed envelope. This was delivered anonymously. No return address. None. Hart opened it carefully. Inside was a single typed sentence. "Stop looking for Thomas Elwood. He's been dead for 25 years. There was nothing else. No signature. No explanation. Only that one chilling warning. Hart read it twice before placing it quietly upon his desk. If Thomas Elwood truly had died 25 years earlier, someone in Bramble Heath knew far more than they had admitted. And if he had not, then the murderer had just revealed something even more dangerous. For the first time since Lady Eleanor's death, Inspector Hart felt certain of one thing. The murder beneath the Whispering Pines had not begun 3 days ago. It had begun a quarter of a century earlier. Only now was the past finally returning to collect its debt. Chapter 5: The Locked Garden House. The morning after the anonymous letter arrived dawned bright and unexpectedly warm. The rain had washed Bramble Heath clean. Every hedge sparkled with droplets, and the village green looked as though it had been painted anew overnight. Yet beneath the peaceful appearance, an invisible tension had settled over the village. People smiled less. Conversations stopped when strangers approached. Doors closed a little sooner than usual. Inspector Edwin Hart noticed the change immediately. Murder always disturbed a community. Secrets disturbed it even more. The anonymous note mentioning Thomas Elwood had spread through the investigation like a stone dropped into still water. No one outside the police station knew about the letter, yet Hart had the uncomfortable feeling that someone was watching every step of his inquiry. Whoever had written the message knew exactly which questions he was beginning to ask. That realization concerned him far more than the words themselves. Across the village, Miss Beatrice Ashcroft finished watering the roses outside her cottage before preparing her usual morning tea. Her thoughts remained fixed on the small silver key bearing the initials T. Thomas Elwood. She placed the key beside the old photograph recovered from the tin box. For several minutes, she studied them together. The photograph had clearly been taken during happier days. Lady Eleanor looked years younger, laughing openly at something outside the frame. Samuel Briggs appeared relaxed. Edwin Price looked almost cheerful. Only Thomas Elwood seemed different. Even in the faded photograph, his eyes appeared to be watching something beyond the camera. Not fearful, watchful. Miss Ashcroft had spent decades observing expressions in classrooms. She trusted them more than words. Someone had carefully folded the photograph to hide Elwood's face. That had not been accidental. Someone had wanted him forgotten. The question was why. Inspector Hart returned to Ashcombe Manor shortly before 10. Samuel Briggs met him once again. "There is one place we haven't searched," the butler admitted. Hart looked up. "What place?" "The old garden house. The small stone building near the eastern orchard?" Briggs nodded. "It has remained locked for years." "Why?" "It was Lady Eleanor's late brother's writing room. No one uses it now." "No." Hart frowned. "And Lady Eleanor kept the key?" "Always." The inspector immediately thought of the silver key discovered inside the hidden tin box. He said nothing. Instead, he asked quietly, "May I see the building?" The garden house stood nearly 200 yards from the manor itself, hidden behind ancient hedges and overlooked by climbing ivy. Few visitors would ever notice it. Built of gray stone with tall, narrow windows, it resembled a tiny chapel more than a garden retreat. Its oak door remained firmly locked. Samuel Briggs examined the lock. "This isn't the original key." "No. Lady Eleanor replaced it perhaps 20 years ago." Hart ran his fingers lightly across the weathered brass plate. "No sign of forced entry." "No." The inspector looked toward Constable Pierce. "Fetch the locksmith." Before the constable could leave, Miss Ashcroft appeared along the garden path, carrying her wicker basket. "Good morning." Hart smiled. "You've arrived at an interesting moment." "So I gathered." Her eyes rested briefly on the locked door. "I wondered when someone might become curious about this place." "You knew it existed?" "I've known it since I first taught at the village school." She smiled gently. "The children always believed it contained pirate treasure. And does it?" "I rather suspect the truth will prove considerably less romantic." Within the hour, the old lock yielded. The heavy wooden door creaked open. Dust drifted through the sunlight. The air smelled of old paper, cedar wood, and years of quiet neglect. The room itself remained astonishingly well preserved. A large writing desk stood beneath the window. Shelves lined with journals covered one wall. A globe occupied one corner. Everything appeared untouched. Yet Inspector Hart noticed something immediately. There was remarkably little dust on the desk itself. Someone had cleaned it. Recently, Constable Pierce noticed it as well. "This place isn't as abandoned as we thought." "No," Hart replied softly. "It isn't." Miss Ashcroft slowly walked around the room. She touched nothing. She merely observed. Books arranged by size. A chair angled slightly away from the desk. Curtains recently straightened. Someone had entered this room within the past few days. Someone careful. Someone who wished the room to appear forgotten. Inspector Hart began examining the desk. Most drawers contained old correspondence and gardening plans. One drawer refused to open. "It appears locked." Samuel Briggs frowned. "I don't remember that." Miss Ashcroft quietly reached into her handbag. Without explanation, she placed the small silver key onto the desk. Inspector Hart looked at her. "You've been holding out on me. I've been waiting until I understood what it might unlock." Hart picked up the key. The initials T gleamed faintly beneath the light. He inserted it carefully. The lock turned immediately. No force. No hesitation. The drawer opened. Inside lay only 3 objects. A leather-bound diary, a bundle of tied letters, and an old brass compass. No jewels. No money. Nothing that would interest an ordinary thief. Yet Inspector Hart felt a surge of anticipation stronger than if the drawer had contained gold. People rarely hid ordinary objects unless their meaning was extraordinary. The diary belonged to Thomas Elwood. Its first pages described routine estate business, tree planting, boundary repairs, Accounts. Nothing remarkable. Then, roughly halfway through, the tone changed. Entries became shorter, more cautious. Several pages had been torn out. Others contained only brief observations. Trust is becoming dangerous. She deserves the truth. Someone has altered the accounts again. Then, near the final written page, one sentence stood alone. If anything happens to me, the garden house must remain closed. No explanation followed. The remaining pages were blank. Inspector Hart carefully closed the diary. Interesting. Miss Ashcroft nodded. Very. Samuel Briggs looked visibly unsettled. I've never seen that diary. I believe you, Hart replied. And these letters? The bundle remained tied with faded blue ribbon. Each envelope bore Lady Eleanor's handwriting. Every one was addressed to Thomas Elwood. None had ever been posted. They opened the first letter carefully. Lady Eleanor apologized for an argument. The second thanked Elwood for protecting the estate during difficult financial years. The third hinted at increasing distrust towards someone whose name was never written in full. Only a single initial appeared. E. Hart looked thoughtfully toward Edwin Price's name in his notebook. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Still, coincidences had misled better investigators than himself. He refused to leap ahead. While the inspector continued examining the letters, Miss Ashcroft wandered toward the single window overlooking the pine woods. From here, the clearing where Lady Eleanor had died was barely visible through the trees. She imagined someone standing in this very room 25 years earlier, watching, waiting, keeping silent. A curious thought occurred to her. If Thomas Elwood wished this room to remain closed, she said quietly, perhaps he wasn't protecting what was inside. Hart looked up. What do you mean? She turned toward him. Perhaps he was protecting whoever might come looking. The inspector considered the possibility. It changed everything. Late that afternoon, as the police carefully packed the diary and letters into evidence boxes, Constable Pierce came running from the orchard. Sir. Hart stepped outside. What is it? The gardener found something. Only 20 yards from the garden house, beneath freshly disturbed soil near an old apple tree, lay a rusted metal cash box. Its lock had long since broken away. Someone had buried it years ago, perhaps decades. Inside was nothing except brittle newspaper wrapped around a single object. Inspector Hart unfolded the paper carefully. Everyone fell silent. Resting in the center was an old gentleman's pocket watch. Its silver cover carried an engraved inscription. To Thomas Elwood, with gratitude. Eleanor Ashcombe. The watch had stopped permanently. Its hands pointed to exactly 4:37. The very minute. According to Dr. Lennox's report, that Lady Eleanor was believed to have died. No one spoke. Only the distant whisper of the pine trees drifted across the orchard. For the first time, Inspector Hart was no longer convinced that Lady Eleanor's murderer had simply tried to hide the past. Someone appeared to be recreating it. And if that was true, the next move in the game had almost certainly already been planned. Chapter 6. A Visitor in the Night. The discovery of Thomas Elwood's pocket watch cast a long shadow over Bramble Heath. By the following morning, Inspector Edwin Hart had ordered the orchard surrounding the old garden house searched from end to end. Constables moved carefully through the damp grass with measuring rods and notebooks, marking every unusual depression in the soil and every object that appeared out of place. Most of what they found was entirely ordinary. Broken flower pots, rusted gardening tools, fragments of old bottles. Nothing that connected directly to Lady Eleanor's death. Yet Inspector Hart had learned long ago that unsuccessful searches were rarely wasted. They often eliminated attractive theories, forcing an investigation onto more solid ground. Constable Daniel Pierce approached, carrying another notebook. Nothing else buried, sir. Hart looked toward the distant pines. Then whoever hid the watch either believed one object was enough. He paused, or returned later to remove everything else. Inside Ashcombe Manor, the atmosphere had grown increasingly strained. The servants carried out their duties with impeccable professionalism, but the easy rhythm that had once characterized the household had disappeared. Meals were quieter, doors closed more gently. Every unexpected knock caused someone to glance toward the entrance hall. Samuel Briggs continued overseeing the household, though Miss Beatrice Ashcroft noticed how much older he suddenly appeared. Grief had a peculiar way of adding years to a person's face. She found him arranging fresh flowers in the drawing room. "They're white lilies," Briggs explained. They were Lady Eleanor's favorite. Miss Ashcroft admired the arrangement. She had excellent taste. Briggs smiled faintly. For flowers, certainly. And for people, the butler hesitated. Usually, not always. He carefully adjusted one of the stems. No one judges character perfectly. Miss Ashcroft allowed the silence to linger. Eventually Briggs spoke again. There was a time when Lady Eleanor trusted Thomas Elwood as completely as she trusted anyone. And afterward, something changed. What? I honestly don't know. He looked genuinely troubled. One autumn, they stopped speaking for nearly 6 months. Did no one ask why? In villages, Briggs replied quietly. People often avoid questions they fear might actually receive answers. Inspector Hart spent the afternoon studying Thomas Elwood's diary again. The brief entries frustrated him. Most contained only fragments of thought. Several names appeared only as initials. Dates referred to events without explaining them. Near the back of the diary, however, one sentence had escaped his notice during the first reading. The accounts are wrong, but the money isn't the real danger. Hart read it 3 times. If the missing money was not the true concern, then what was? He turned to the bundle of unopened letters written by Lady Eleanor. One paragraph in particular attracted his attention. If the truth ever becomes public, the village will blame the wrong person. No names, no explanation, only that cryptic warning. The inspector closed the letter carefully. Someone had spent 25 years protecting a secret. Lady Eleanor had died before revealing it. That evening Miss Ashcroft paid a visit to Margaret Bell. Margaret was trimming roses in her small front garden when she looked up with surprise. What a pleasant surprise. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. Tea appeared within minutes. As they settled into the sitting room, conversation wandered naturally through memories of Lady Eleanor. Margaret smiled sadly. She never forgot anyone's birthday. That requires unusual attention. She remembered the smallest kindnesses. Miss Ashcroft stirred her tea. Did she ever mention Thomas Elwood? Margaret stopped stirring her own cup. Only once. When? Years ago. What did she say? Margaret frowned thoughtfully. It wasn't much. She closed her eyes, searching her memory. Someone mentioned his name after church. And Lady Eleanor said. She paused. Some people disappear because they choose to. Miss Ashcroft waited. There was something else. Margaret looked toward the window. Others disappear because everyone finds it convenient to stop looking. The room fell quiet. Neither woman spoke for several moments. It was the sort of remark that sounded ordinary until examined carefully. Meanwhile, Gregory Ashcombe wandered through the library alone. He had begun sorting Lady Eleanor's papers, hoping routine might distract him. Instead, every document reminded him of her absence. Receipts, letters, committee minutes, garden plans. Each carried her precise handwriting. As he reached for another folder, a folded sheet slipped from between 2 account books. He unfolded it. It was not a letter. It was a map, a hand-drawn sketch of the Ashcombe estate. Most of it appeared ordinary. The manor, the gardens, the orchard, the whispering pines. Near the woodland clearing, a small cross had been drawn in faded blue ink. Beside it appeared only 2 words. Old Boundary. Gregory stared at the map. He had explored the estate since childhood. He had never heard anyone mention an old boundary. Before dawn the next morning, someone entered the gardens. The figure wore a dark raincoat and carried a shaded lantern. Moving carefully through the mist, the intruder avoided the gravel paths, choosing instead the softer grass beneath the hedges. No lights appeared inside the manor. The household slept. The figure reached the old garden house. The newly fitted police lock remained intact. For several seconds the visitor examined it. Then, apparently deciding against forcing entry, the figure disappeared toward the orchard. A faint metallic sound echoed through the darkness. Not loud enough to wake anyone, only enough to suggest digging. 20 minutes later, the visitor vanished into the pine woods. It was Samuel Briggs who made the discovery shortly after sunrise. The flower bed near the apple tree had been disturbed again. Fresh soil covered the grass. He immediately notified Inspector Hart. Within an hour, the inspector stood examining the area. Whoever had returned clearly believed something remained buried nearby. Constable Pierce knelt beside a set of footprints. They're clearer than yesterday. Hart nodded. The rain helped. The impressions belonged to sturdy leather boots. Unusual only because one heel had worn unevenly. The right footprint leaned slightly outward. Someone with that pattern of wear would leave it almost anywhere they walked. If they could identify the boots, perhaps they could identify the owner. Miss Ashcroft arrived just as the examination concluded. Hart greeted her. "I was hoping you'd come. I thought you might." He showed her the disturbed earth. "Our visitor returned, but found nothing. So it appears." Miss Ashcroft looked thoughtfully toward the woodland. Unless finding nothing was exactly what they expected. Hart raised an eyebrow. "You think this was meant to mislead us?" "Perhaps." She walked slowly around the flower bed. Then she stopped. "Inspector." He joined her. She pointed toward the edge of the grass. Caught beneath a low rose branch was a tiny strip of dark blue cloth. Not torn violently, simply snagged. Hart carefully lifted it with tweezers. The fabric was old but of exceptional quality. He compared it silently with the sample recovered beside the missing porcelain button. Different cloth, different garment, another person, or another carefully planted clue. Either possibility troubled him. That afternoon, the surveyor from the county land office arrived to examine Gregory's map. After studying it for nearly an hour, he reached an unexpected conclusion. The old boundary no longer exists. When did it disappear? Hart asked. Approximately 24 years ago. Why? The estate expanded. What stood there before? The surveyor consulted an old record. A small gate. Leading where? Into neighboring woodland. Who owned that land? The surveyor smiled faintly. Thomas Elwood. Inspector Hart looked up sharply. For the first time, Thomas Elwood was no longer merely an estate manager who had vanished. He had once owned land directly beside Ashcombe Manor, land that had quietly become part of the Ashcombe estate after his disappearance. Late that evening, Miss Ashcroft sat beside her sitting room window, looking out across the quiet village. She spread the photograph, the diary notes she had copied, and Gregory's map across her table. Each seemed unrelated, yet she felt the invisible thread connecting them. Lady Eleanor had protected something. Thomas Elwood had hidden something. Someone had returned after 25 years searching for something. The answer, she suspected, did not lie in the objects themselves. It lay in the people who kept returning to them. Outside, the whispering pines swayed beneath the rising moon. Their soft murmur drifted across Bramble Heath as it had for generations. The trees remembered nothing. People did. And somewhere in the village, a person who had believed the past safely buried was beginning to understand that every hidden truth leaves roots behind. Sooner or later, those roots always find their way back to the surface. Chapter 7. Beyond the Old Boundary. The old boundary no longer existed on any modern map. Yet by 8 o'clock the following morning, Inspector Edwin Hart and Miss Beatrice Ashcroft found themselves standing where it had once divided the Ashcombe estate from Thomas Elwood's small parcel of woodland. The surveyor's directions had been remarkably precise. The stone markers were never removed, he had explained. They simply disappeared beneath ivy. He had been correct. Half buried among moss and tangled brambles, two weathered granite posts still faced one another across what had once been a narrow opening in the hedge. Time had softened their edges, and ivy wrapped around them like thick green rope, but their purpose remained unmistakable. For decades, someone had passed through that gate. Now only the forest remembered it. Inspector Hart examined the ground. No recent footprints. Miss Ashcroft smiled gently. Not everyone follows the obvious path. She stepped several feet away and looked not at the ground, but at the trees themselves. The branches above the forgotten gateway were noticeably thinner than those surrounding them. Hart followed her gaze. A clearing, or what used to be one. The inspector quietly pushed aside several overgrown branches. Beyond them lay a faint trail disappearing deeper into the woodland. Nature had almost reclaimed it. Almost. Constable Daniel Pierce joined them carrying a long measuring staff. It isn't marked on any current estate plans. It wouldn't be, Hart replied. The gate vanished when the boundary changed. Miss Ashcroft slowly walked along the forgotten trail. She noticed details the others overlooked. The bark rubbed smooth on one side of an oak tree. A broken section of old fencing almost hidden beneath fern leaves. Several unusually flat stones arranged in a rough line. Not naturally, deliberately. Someone wanted this path to disappear, she observed. Inspector Hart nodded. The question is whether they wanted to hide where it led. He looked farther into the woods, or where it came from. The path eventually opened into a small glade unlike any other part of the woodland. Here the towering pines gave way to broad beech trees whose leaves filtered the morning sunlight into shifting patterns across the forest floor. In the center stood the remains of an old stone cottage. Only 2 walls still remained standing. The roof had collapsed years before. Wildflowers now grew where a fireplace had once warmed the room. Constable Pierce looked around in surprise. "I've lived here my entire life, and never knew this existed." "So have most people," Miss Ashcroft replied. The inspector approached the ruined doorway. Above it hung a rusted iron hook. Nearby lay fragments of broken pottery. Nothing appeared unusual until Hart noticed the fireplace. Unlike the rest of the cottage, it remained remarkably intact. Almost too intact. He knelt beside the old hearth. The mortar's newer. Pierce crouched beside him. "How can you tell?" "The color." He tapped one of the stones gently. It produced a hollow sound. Miss Ashcroft heard it immediately. There is space behind it. Removing the loose stone required only a few minutes. Behind it lay a narrow cavity sealed from view for many years. Inside rested a small wooden box wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Unlike the tin box discovered earlier, this one showed no signs of water damage. Someone had gone to considerable effort to preserve it. Hart carried it into the sunlight before opening the lid. Inside lay only 4 objects: a brass fountain pen, a folded survey map, a leather wallet containing several faded receipts, and a sealed envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. For Eleanor. No surname, no date, only those 2 words. Inspector Hart turned the envelope over. The wax seal remained unbroken. Miss Ashcroft looked thoughtful. If Thomas Elwood wrote it. Lady Eleanor never read it, Hart finished. The envelope had remained sealed for at least 25 years. Back at Ashcombe Manor, Gregory Ashcombe sat in the library sorting through his aunt's charitable records. The work had become strangely comforting. Numbers remained honest. People rarely did. Samuel Briggs entered carrying fresh tea. "You've hardly left this room." Gregory smiled faintly. "It keeps my mind occupied." Briggs placed the tray upon the table. "There is something I've been meaning to tell you." Gregory looked up. "What is it?" The butler hesitated. "I wasn't certain it mattered." "It probably does." Briggs drew a slow breath. "The evening before the fete." "Yes. I overheard Lady Eleanor making a telephone call." "To whom?" "I don't know." "What did she say?" Briggs searched his memory carefully. Only one sentence. He repeated it exactly as he remembered. "Tomorrow, beneath the pines. No more delays." Gregory stared at him. "You're certain?" "I've repeated those words to myself ever since." Neither man spoke for several moments. Lady Eleanor had arranged a meeting. That much now seemed beyond doubt. The remaining question was painfully obvious. With whom? Inspector Hart returned to the manor shortly after noon carrying the newly discovered wooden box. He gathered Gregory, Samuel Briggs, Edwin Price, and Dr. Arthur Lennox in the library. Without comment, he placed the sealed envelope upon the table. Edwin Price frowned. "I recognize that handwriting." Hart looked toward him. "You do?" "It belongs to Thomas Elwood." No one disputed him. The solicitor had handled enough estate correspondence over the years to recognize a signature or handwriting with confidence. Hart examined the unbroken seal once more. "I intend to open it." Price nodded. "I believe Lady Eleanor would have wanted that." Using a small paper knife, Hart carefully broke the wax. Inside lay a single folded sheet. The paper had yellowed with age but remained perfectly legible. He began reading silently. After only a few lines, his expression changed. Miss Ashcroft noticed immediately. "So," she asked quietly, "it wasn't a farewell letter?" "No." Hart folded the paper again. "It was a request." "For what?" He looked around the room. Thomas Elwood asked Lady Eleanor to meet him at the old boundary. "When?" "The morning after he disappeared." Silence settled heavily across the library. "But she never received the letter," Gregory whispered. Hart nodded slowly. "It remained hidden in that ruined cottage all these years." Which meant Thomas Elwood had waited for someone who never arrived. That evening the village prepared for Lady Eleanor's memorial service. Flowers appeared outside the church. Candles were arranged beneath the stained glass windows. The bell rang softly across Bramble Heath as residents arrived in quiet groups. Miss Ashcroft took her usual seat near the middle aisle. She observed familiar faces. Margaret Bell sat beside Reverend Collins. Samuel Briggs occupied the front pew. Gregory remained alone. Dr. Lennox appeared unusually pale. Edwin Price avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Grief affected people differently. So did guilt. During the final hymn, Miss Ashcroft noticed something unexpected. A man standing near the rear door quietly slipped outside before the service ended. She recognized him only from behind. Tall, dark overcoat, walking stick. The ferrule of the stick was unusually narrow, exactly like the impression she had discovered beside the bench in the Whispering Pines. She waited, counted silently to 10, then rose without attracting attention and followed. Outside, the churchyard lay almost empty. The man had vanished. Only the damp gravel path remained. Yet something else caught her eye. Beneath the old yew tree rested a fresh bouquet of white lilies. Tucked discreetly beneath the ribbon was a folded card. There was no name, only a single handwritten sentence. Some promises survive longer than people. Miss Ashcroft read it twice before slipping the card carefully into her handbag. Whoever had left it had not come merely to mourn Lady Eleanor. They had come to remind someone that an old promise remained unfinished. As darkness settled over Bramble Heath, the Whispering Pines stirred once again beyond the churchyard. For the first time since the investigation had begun, Miss Ashcroft became certain of one thing. The murder of Lady Eleanor Ashcombe had never been intended as the end of the story. It was the final chapter of a promise made 25 years earlier. The beginning of that promise still lay hidden somewhere in the village, and someone was growing increasingly desperate to keep it that way. Chapter 8: The Promise in the Pines. The morning after Lady Eleanor's memorial service broke with brilliant sunshine. It seemed almost inappropriate. After days of gray skies and quiet rain, Bramble Heath should have felt renewed beneath the clear blue sky. Instead, the brightness only emphasized how much had changed. Curtains were drawn back, shops reopened, and children once again crossed the village green on their way to school, but conversation still lowered whenever the murder was mentioned. Life was returning. Normality was not. Miss Beatrice Ashcroft stood in her garden trimming lavender when Inspector Edwin Hart arrived shortly after 9. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," she replied, placing the shears into her basket. "Flowers are patient. Mysteries are not." Hart smiled faintly. "I've been thinking about the card you found." "So have I." She removed it from a small envelope. The handwriting remained steady and deliberate. "Some promises survive longer than people." "It isn't a threat," Hart observed. "No, a warning." "I don't believe so." Miss Ashcroft looked toward the distant line of pine trees. "It sounds more like a reminder." "A reminder to whom?" "That," she answered quietly, "is precisely the question." Back at the police station, Inspector Hart spread every significant piece of evidence across a large table. Thomas Elwood's diary, the unopened letters Lady Eleanor had written, the photograph recovered from the hidden tin box, the silver key, the estate map, the anonymous note, the pocket watch, the card left beneath the lilies. Constable Daniel Pierce stood silently beside him. "It feels as though we're missing something obvious." Hart nodded. "We are." "What?" "The order." Pierce frowned. "The order? We've treated every discovery as though it belongs to the same day." The inspector rearranged the evidence. "But these objects spanned 25 years. He pointed toward the diary. "This came first, then the letters. The correspondence followed. Next came the survey map. The boundary changed. Finally, he placed Lady Eleanor's invitation beside the card. And only then do we arrive at the murder." Pierce studied the arrangement. "It tells a story. It tells part of one." Hart looked thoughtfully at the photograph. "But someone removed an entire chapter." Meanwhile, Gregory Ashcombe made an unexpected decision. For the first time since his aunt's death, he entered the west attic of Ashcombe Manor. The room had become a repository for generations of forgotten possessions. Dust-covered trunks stood beneath sloping beams. Portraits leaned against walls beneath white sheets. Broken clocks and worn furniture filled every corner. Lady Eleanor rarely threw anything away. Gregory remembered her saying once, "Old things often remember what people prefer to forget." He smiled sadly at the memory. After nearly an hour of searching, he discovered a cedar chest bearing his grandfather's initials. Inside lay family albums, Christmas cards, estate ledgers, and dozens of carefully labeled envelopes. One envelope immediately caught his attention. "Estate employees, 25 years ago." He carried it downstairs. Inside were personnel records for gardeners, maids, stable hands, and estate workers. Thomas Elwood's file should have been among them. It wasn't. Every employee record remained intact. Except one. Someone had removed Elwood's file completely. Not recently. Years ago. Gregory stared at the empty space. Whoever had removed it had known exactly where to look. Miss Ashcroft spent the afternoon visiting the village library. Mrs. Helen Forster, the librarian, greeted her warmly. "I wondered when you'd appear." "Did you?" The inspector asks official questions. "And I?" "You ask interesting ones." They shared a smile. Miss Ashcroft explained that she wished to examine old copies of the Bramble Heath Gazette from 25 years earlier. The librarian disappeared into the archive room and returned pushing a small trolley stacked with bound newspapers. Hours passed quietly. Wedding announcements, harvest festivals, council meetings, school concerts. Nothing unusual. Then, in an autumn edition, Miss Ashcroft found a brief article tucked into the corner of the third page. Local estate manager leaves district. The report consisted of only 4 paragraphs. It stated that Thomas Elwood had resigned unexpectedly and intended to travel abroad. No destination was mentioned. No farewell gathering had been held. No replacement had yet been appointed. The article ended with a curious sentence. The family requests privacy and asks that no further speculation be encouraged. Miss Ashcroft read it twice. That final sentence seemed oddly formal for a routine resignation. Someone had wanted discussion to end quickly. Late that afternoon, Inspector Hart received another visitor. Frederick Lawson, the retired tailor, carried an old leather appointment book. I remembered something. Hart invited him inside. "I've been thinking about those coats. The ones made for Colonel Ashcombe, Edwin Price, and Thomas Elwood?" Lawson nodded. There was actually a 4th order. Hart looked up immediately. A 4th. It was canceled before delivery. For whom? Lawson opened the faded ledger. The initials are difficult to read. He adjusted his spectacles. Either Yelda. He paused. Or HL. Can you make out the surname? I'm afraid not. The page had been damaged by water many years earlier. Still, it was enough to trouble the inspector. Another tailored coat. Another possible missing button. Another person connected somehow to events decades earlier. The circle had quietly grown larger. As evening approached, Miss Ashcroft asked Samuel Briggs to walk with her through the manor gardens. The old butler accepted gratefully. They followed the gravel path toward the Whispering Pines without speaking for several minutes. Finally, Miss Ashcroft stopped beside a stone bench. "May I ask you something difficult?" Briggs nodded. "You may ask. You needn't answer." He smiled sadly. "I suspect you've already guessed that." She looked at him kindly. "When Thomas Elwood disappeared." "Yes." "Did Lady Eleanor believe he had abandoned her?" Briggs closed his eyes briefly. "For many years. And afterward?" "I think she stopped believing it." "What changed?" "I don't know." He looked toward the trees. "But she began returning to these woods every year on the same date." "The anniversary?" "Yes. Always alone. So far as I knew." Miss Ashcroft considered this carefully. If Lady Eleanor had believed Thomas Elwood innocent, why had she never told anyone? Unless she had been protecting someone else. That night, Inspector Hart couldn't sleep. Near midnight, he returned alone to the evidence room. One object continued troubling him more than any other. The old photograph. He removed it from its protective sleeve and studied it beneath a bright desk lamp. Lady Eleanor, Samuel Briggs, Edwin Price, Thomas Elwood. Behind them stood the Whispering Pines. Something in the background caught his attention. A small wooden sign, almost hidden behind Elwood's shoulder. Earlier, he had dismissed it as part of the scenery. Now he reached for a magnifying glass. The faded lettering slowly became legible. Boundary Walk. Hart sat back. Boundary Walk. Not boundary gate. Not boundary line. A walk. There had once been an established footpath running through the woodland. He immediately reached for the old estate survey. The modern maps showed no such path. Neither did the revised plans after the estate expansion. Someone had deliberately erased it. Not merely from the land. From the records. Before dawn, Constable Pierce arrived with urgent news. "Inspector." Hart looked up. "We've had another break-in." "No, sir." "What then?" "The church sexton found fresh footprints." "Where?" "At Lady Eleanor's grave." Hart rose immediately. Minutes later, they stood in the quiet churchyard. The grave itself had not been disturbed. Neither had the flowers. Only the damp earth nearby bore evidence of a visitor. One set of footprints approached. The same set departed. The heel of the right boot leaned outward in the now familiar way. The visitor had remained there for several minutes. Nothing more, nothing less. As Hart examined the ground, Miss Ashcroft arrived through the church gate. She looked at the footprints only briefly before raising her eyes toward the distant pine woods. They're running out of time. Hart turned. What makes you think that? People who revisit old places aren't usually searching for memories. She paused. They're checking whether something is still there. The inspector followed her gaze. Beyond the churchyard, beyond the hedgerows, the tops of the whispering pines moved gently in the morning breeze. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the forgotten boundary walk. Someone had erased it from maps. Someone had hidden letters, diaries, and keys. Someone had returned repeatedly after Lady Eleanor's death. And now, after 25 years of silence, that same unseen hand had begun visiting the dead. Inspector Hart folded the survey map carefully. We've been looking in the wrong place. Miss Ashcroft nodded. I believe so. Then where should we be looking? She smiled with quiet certainty. Not for what Thomas Elwood left behind. She looked once more toward the forest. For what he intended someone to find. For the first time since the investigation began, both of them understood that the final answers would not be uncovered in Ashcombe Manor, the churchyard, or the garden house. They were waiting somewhere along the forgotten boundary walk, a place that someone had spent a quarter of a century trying to erase from memory. Yet memories, like paths through old woods, have a curious habit. Even when overgrown, they are never truly gone. Chapter 9, The Last Secret of Boundary Walk. The boundary walk revealed itself only to those who knew precisely where to look. At first light, Inspector Edwin Hart, Miss Beatrice Ashcroft, Constable Daniel Pierce, and the county surveyor stood at the forgotten entrance hidden beneath decades of ivy and bramble. Overnight, laborers had carefully cleared only enough vegetation to expose the original path without disturbing the surrounding woodland. The narrow trail stretched away between towering pines before disappearing beneath a canopy of beech and oak. It doesn't seem remarkable, Pierce observed. Miss Ashcroft smiled gently. Most important places rarely do. They began walking. The woodland was strangely quiet. Even the birds seemed reluctant to disturb the morning. Only the soft whisper of wind through the pines accompanied them. Hart carried the old survey map in one hand. Every few yards, he compared the faded drawing with the landscape before him. The path bends here, he said quietly. It should lead toward the old cottage. It did, replied the surveyor. But not originally. Hart looked up. What do you mean? The cottage was built years after the path. So what stood here first? The surveyor pointed farther ahead. A boundary stone. Nearly half an hour later they found it. The stone rose waist-high from the forest floor, its weathered surface covered with moss and lichen. Time had almost erased the carved initials upon its face. Almost. Pierce brushed away the moss carefully. A and E. The surveyor nodded. Ashcombe Estate. On the opposite side, another inscription slowly emerged. T. E. Thomas Elwood. Hart frowned thoughtfully. This wasn't simply a boundary. No. The surveyor folded his arms. It marked an agreement. Between neighbors? Between friends. Miss Ashcroft stepped closer. Friendship often leaves more permanent marks than ownership. The inspector slowly circled the stone. One side appeared unusually smooth. Too smooth. As though generations of hands had rested there. He pressed gently. Nothing happened. Miss Ashcroft, however, had noticed something else. A shallow groove circled the base. It moves. Pierce stared. The stone. Not the whole stone. She knelt. The top. Together Hart and Pierce pushed carefully. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the upper portion rotated with a deep grinding sound that echoed softly through the trees. Inside lay a narrow hollow. Empty. Completely empty. Pierce looked disappointed. Someone got here first. Hart wasn't convinced. No. He examined the interior. There hasn't been anything here for years. Miss Ashcroft nodded. This wasn't a hiding place. What then? A meeting place. Back at Ashcombe Manor, Gregory Ashcombe continued sorting through the final boxes from the attic. Most contained household accounts, old invitations, and faded photographs. One small leather portfolio had escaped his attention. Inside were sketches drawn by Lady Eleanor herself. She was not a great artist, yet every drawing depicted the same subject. The woodland, the pines, the old boundary walk. One sketch included two figures standing beside the boundary stone. Neither face had been completed. Only their outlines remained. On the back, Lady Eleanor had written a single sentence. Promises should never depend upon witnesses. Gregory stared at the words for a long time. He had heard his aunt speak of promises many times. Never once had she explained that remark. Inspector Hart returned to the manor shortly after noon. He spread the sketch beside the photograph recovered from the hidden tin box. Miss Ashcroft joined him. Notice anything? She studied both images carefully. The trees. Hart nodded. What about them? The photograph shows 5 pines. The sketch? Only 4. Pierce looked puzzled. Trees die. They do, Miss Ashcroft agreed. But not usually without leaving evidence. Hart reached immediately for the survey map. According to the oldest drawing, 5 pines had indeed surrounded the boundary stone. Today, only 4 remained. The 5th had disappeared. When? He asked aloud. Samuel Briggs, who had entered unnoticed, answered quietly. About 22 years ago. Everyone turned toward him. It was struck by lightning. What happened afterward? Hart asked. It was cut down. Were the roots removed? No. Who ordered it? Briggs hesitated. Lady Eleanor. That afternoon the party returned once more to Boundary Walk. The stump remained exactly where Briggs had described. Covered in moss and surrounded by wildflowers. It seemed entirely unremarkable. Hart examined it carefully. The tree had indeed been cut decades earlier. Miss Ashcroft walked slowly around the clearing. Then she stopped. The ground slopes. Pierce looked puzzled. So, it shouldn't. She tapped the earth lightly with her walking stick. A hollow sound answered. Hart looked at her. Again. She tapped a second time. The sound remained unmistakable. Constables carefully removed the layer of moss surrounding the old stump. Beneath it lay fitted stone, not natural rock, a carefully constructed circular cover. It took all 4 men to lift it. Below stretched a narrow brick-lined chamber, scarcely 4 feet deep. Inside rested a single iron chest. Unlike every previous discovery, this chest showed no signs of disturbance. Its lock had rusted completely shut. Pierce whispered almost involuntarily. My word, the chest was carried unopened to Ashcombe Manor. Hart refused to force it open in the woods. Too many years had passed. Too much could be damaged. By evening, a locksmith had carefully removed the corroded lock. Everyone gathered in the library. Gregory, Samuel Briggs, Edwin Price, Dr. Arthur Lennox, Miss Ashcroft, Constable Pierce. Inspector Hart slowly lifted the lid. Inside were neatly arranged bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Property deeds, account books, personal correspondence. Every document remained perfectly dry. Near the bottom lay a sealed packet labeled in Thomas Elwood's handwriting. To be opened only if I cannot return. The room fell silent. Hart carefully unfolded the packet. The first pages consisted of financial records. Each account balanced perfectly. The missing estate funds mentioned in Elwood's diary had never been stolen. They had been transferred legally into a charitable reserve established during a difficult year for the estate. Someone had later altered the official ledgers to suggest the money had disappeared. Pierce looked astonished. So Elwood was innocent. Hart nodded slowly. At least of financial misconduct. The inspector continued reading. The later pages became increasingly personal. Thomas wrote of growing distrust, of discovering documents that someone desperately wished to conceal, of deciding to leave temporarily until the truth could safely be revealed. Then came the final page. Hart stopped reading. Miss Ashcroft noticed immediately. What is it? He looked around the room. This changes everything. No one spoke. It explains why Lady Eleanor spent 25 years believing Thomas intended to return. Gregory leaned forward, and Hart folded the final page. It also explains why someone believed she must never tell anyone what she knew. Edwin Price adjusted his spectacles. What does it say? The inspector looked toward the library windows where twilight had begun settling across the gardens. It names a witness. A witness. Yes. The only person besides Thomas who knew what truly happened the night he disappeared. Silence settled over the room. Miss Ashcroft watched every face. Not dramatically, simply carefully. One expression changed almost imperceptibly, a tightening around the eyes. A hand closing slightly upon the arm of a chair. Gone almost before it appeared. Almost. She said nothing. Not yet. That night Bramble Heath lay unusually still. The moon hung low above the whispering pines. Inspector Hart remained awake in the library rereading Thomas Elwood's final statement. Every unanswered question now possessed an answer. Every unexplained object suddenly made sense. The button, the pocket watch, the diary, the hidden key, the letters, the boundary walk, even Lady Eleanor's final meeting beneath the pines. Each piece belonged to a single story, a story that had remained unfinished for 25 years. Miss Ashcroft joined him quietly. "You know," Hart nodded. "I believe I do." "And the murderer?" "Yes." She looked toward the dark windows. "They'll make one final mistake." "You seem very certain." She smiled with the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime observing ordinary people. "Inspector, secrets can survive for decades." She paused. But guilty consciences rarely survive the moment they realize the truth has finally been uncovered. Outside, the whispering pines swayed gently beneath the moonlight. For the first time since Lady Eleanor Ashcombe's death, the mystery no longer belonged to the past. It belonged to tomorrow. And tomorrow, someone in Bramble Heath would discover that the quietest observer in the village had understood far more than anyone had ever imagined. Chapter 10. Beneath the Whispering Pines. The following evening, Ashcombe Manor welcomed guests once more. Unlike the summer fete that had ended in tragedy only days earlier, there were no ribbons fluttering from the terrace, no music drifting across the lawns, and no cheerful laughter echoing through the gardens. Instead, the drawing room had been arranged with quiet precision. A fire burned gently despite the mild evening, casting warm light across polished oak furniture and the portraits of generations long gone. Heavy curtains remained open, revealing the dark outline of the whispering pines beyond the windows. Inspector Edwin Hart stood beside the fireplace. Constable Daniel Pierce occupied the doorway. Miss Beatrice Ashcroft sat quietly in her favorite chair near the window, knitting resting untouched in her lap. One by one, the remaining guests arrived. Gregory Ashcombe, Samuel Briggs, Edwin Price, Dr. Arthur Lennox, Margaret Bell, Reverend Collins. None of them knew precisely why they had been invited. Each suspected the answer. When everyone had taken a seat, Inspector Hart broke the silence. "Thank you all for coming." No one replied. "The investigation into Lady Eleanor Ashcombe's death has reached its conclusion." A faint rustle passed through the room. "The evidence has revealed not one mystery." He paused, but two. He placed Thomas Elwood's diary upon the table. For 25 years this village believed Thomas Elwood disappeared after mismanaging the Ashcombe estate. Hart slowly shook his head. That belief was false. He explained how the financial records recovered from the hidden chamber proved the estate accounts had never been stolen. Thomas Elwood had discovered discrepancies in the official ledgers, not because he created them, but because someone else had altered them. Rather than accuse anyone publicly without proof, he had gathered the original documents and hidden them beneath the old pine stump along Boundary Walk. He intended to return after collecting additional evidence, but he never did. Hart lifted the sealed statement Thomas had left behind. He feared someone would silence him. The room remained perfectly still. He was correct. Gregory spoke quietly. "So Thomas was murdered?" Inspector Hart nodded. "No body was ever found, but his disappearance was no accident." A long silence followed. At last Edwin Price whispered, "Who?" Hart looked toward Miss Ashcroft. She set her knitting aside. "It may help," she said gently, "to think not about who benefited from Thomas disappearing." She smiled faintly. "But who benefited from everyone believing he had simply gone away?" Every eye turned toward her. She continued calmly. "Lady Eleanor spent years believing Thomas had abandoned the village. Eventually she discovered he had intended to meet her. She touched the old letter addressed for Eleanor. By then it was too late. She realized someone had intercepted his message." Hart nodded, and she quietly began searching for the truth. "For 25 years." Samuel Briggs lowered his head. "I always wondered why she returned to the woods every autumn." "She wasn't remembering the past," Miss Ashcroft replied softly. "She was waiting for it." Inspector Hart stepped forward. When Lady Eleanor finally discovered the hidden chamber beneath the old pine stump, she understood everything. He looked around the room. She arranged a meeting beneath the whispering pines. She intended to confront the only surviving witness. The words settled over the room like falling snow. "Dr. Arthur Lennox slowly removed his spectacles. His hands trembled, almost imperceptibly. Miss Ashcroft noticed, as she always had. She spoke with the same gentle tone she might have used while correcting a child. "Doctor," Arthur looked up. "You watched the woods throughout the fete. You arrived unusually early the day before. You became uneasy whenever Thomas Elwood's name was mentioned." She paused. "And you were the only person who knew exactly how Lady Eleanor would react after discovering the hidden documents." The doctor's face remained calm. "Too calm. You believe I killed her?" "I believe," Miss Ashcroft replied, "that you've been carrying two tragedies for 25 years. Inspector Hart carefully unfolded the final page of Thomas Elwood's statement. It identifies the last witness present on the night Thomas disappeared. He looked directly at Dr. Lennox. "Arthur Lennox." No one moved. The doctor closed his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than before. "I was 26. No one interrupted. I had only recently become the village doctor." He stared into the fire. "Thomas asked me to meet him at Boundary Walk. He wanted medical advice. He believed someone intended to attack him." Arthur's voice faltered. I laughed. He swallowed hard. I told him he was imagining enemies. The room remained silent. The following morning I found him. Margaret Bell gasped softly. Arthur continued. "He wasn't dead. He had been struck during a struggle. He begged me not to involve the police until Lady Eleanor received his documents. I left to fetch help." His shoulders slumped. When I returned, he looked toward the floor. He was gone. Inspector Hart spoke quietly. "You never told anyone." "I should have." Arthur nodded slowly. "I was frightened. I feared no one would believe me. So I convinced myself he had survived." He laughed bitterly. "For years I repeated that lie until I almost believed it myself." Gregory frowned. "But that doesn't explain my aunt." Arthur's eyes filled with sorrow. "It does." He looked around the room. "When Lady Eleanor confronted me beneath the whispering pines," his voice almost disappeared. "She already knew. She had found Thomas's statement. She knew I'd kept silent." Miss Ashcroft listened without interrupting. Arthur continued. "She wasn't angry. That was the worst part. She simply asked me why." "What did you tell her?" Hart asked. "The truth. I said I had spent 25 years wishing I had gone back sooner." He covered his face briefly. "She said the truth should finally be known." "What happened then?" Arthur closed his eyes. "She turned to leave. I reached for her arm. She slipped on the wet pine needles. The room seemed to stop breathing. I tried to catch her. I couldn't. There was a stone. Silence. I called her name. She never answered." Inspector Hart allowed several moments to pass before speaking. The medical examination supported exactly that sequence. There were no signs of assault, no defensive wounds. The fatal injury resulted from the fall. He looked around the room. Lady Eleanor's death was caused by a tragic accident. Everyone stared at him. "But," he continued firmly, "what followed was not." Arthur bowed his head. I panicked. I remembered Thomas. I thought no one would believe another accident connected to the same woods. So I removed the papers she carried. I replaced them with the fate invitation. I fled. "The porcelain button?" Hart asked. "My coat caught on a branch." "The pocket watch?" "I buried it years ago after finding it near the old boundary." "The anonymous letter?" Arthur nodded. I hoped the investigation would stop. Tears rolled quietly down his face. "I never meant to harm Lady Eleanor. I only wanted the past to stay buried." Miss Ashcroft looked at him with quiet sadness. "The past never remains buried. It waits." Inspector Hart stepped toward the doctor. "Arthur Lennox." The doctor rose slowly. "I understand." Without resistance, he offered his hands. Constable Pierce stepped forward. No struggle followed. Only silence. As the doctor was led from the room, he paused beside Gregory. "I loved your aunt." Gregory looked at him steadily. "I believe you." Arthur lowered his head. "And that," Gregory said quietly, "is what makes it so unbearably sad." Several weeks later, Bramble Heath slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. The investigation formally concluded that Thomas Elwood had died as the result of an assault decades earlier, though the person responsible could no longer be identified with certainty after so many years. Lady Eleanor's death was recognized as an accidental fall that was followed by Dr. Lennox's deliberate concealment of evidence, preventing the truth from coming to light for far too long. Thomas Elwood's hidden documents cleared his name completely. His reputation, lost for 25 years, was restored. The charitable trust he had worked to protect was finally established exactly as Lady Eleanor had intended. A modest stone was placed beside the old boundary walk. It bore only a few simple words. In memory of Thomas Elwood. Truth may arrive late, but it is never lost. On a warm afternoon not long afterward, Miss Ashcroft sat beneath the same umbrella where the village fete had begun. Her knitting rested peacefully in her lap. Inspector Hart joined her with 2 cups of tea. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "Human nature." She smiled. "It rarely changes." "No, it doesn't." They sat together in comfortable silence while the breeze moved gently through the ancient pines. Visitors still called them the Whispering Pines. Some claimed the trees carried old voices. Miss Ashcroft knew better. It was never the trees that whispered. It was memory. And memory, when finally allowed to speak, could be kinder than silence. For in Bramble Heath, peace had returned, not because the village had forgotten the past, but because, at last, it no longer had to hide from it. The end.